At dawn, Myanmar woke to an unimaginable disaster. The ground rumbled like an angry giant, shaking the very earth beneath the villagers' feet. A deep, guttural roar sounded through the mountains, as if the mountains themselves had come alive. Houses cracked open like brittle eggs, entire homes collapsing in a deafening cacophony. The once peaceful hills which had cradled the villages for centuries became a chaotic labyrinth of destruction. Children cried out for their mothers. Mothers screamed for their children. The smell of dust and smoke was everywhere. The world was shaking, and there was no place to run, no place to hide. In the wake of the massive earthquake, everything was fractured. The ground, the homes, the hearts of the villagers. The horizon was choked with dust, thick and suffocating, and the cries of the wounded and the lost filled the air. Buildings that once stood proud now lay in ruins, piles of rubble and twisted metal where memories had once lived. The earth trembled, but it was the people who were broken. As the rescue teams rushed to the epicenter of the devastation, there was no time to mourn. Every moment stretched on forever, each passing second slipping away, lost to the ever-growing pile of debris that covered the village. Every hour meant fewer chances to find survivors, fewer chances for miracles, and the earth kept trembling, as though it too mourned the destruction it had caused. But amid the chaos, amid the hopelessness and despair, there was something different, something that no one could explain. As rescuers combed through the mountain of wreckage, they began to lose hope. One particular village on the hillside had suffered more than most, a small, isolated community with narrow roads, simple homes, and an almost peaceful stillness that had been ripped away in an instant. The crumbled ruins of one home seemed to swallow the earth itself, its walls caved in, its foundation reduced to dust. There was no sound, no movement, only the stillness of death. No one had survived here, they thought. Then, through the silence, came a bark. It wasn't a scream for help. It wasn't a cry for rescue. It wasn't the sound of a person trying to escape the rubble. It was the sound of a dog. A stray dog, thin and covered in ash, stood at the edge of the destruction. Its eyes darted from one side to the other, its fur matted with dirt and dust, its body thin from hunger and exposure. Yet, there was no hesitation in its movement, no fear in its stance. It barked again, its voice sharp and frantic, its body tense, its tail stiff, as if it was calling out for something, someone. It wasn't a normal bark, it was a cry for a purpose, a warning that couldn't be ignored. The rescuers paused. Confusion spread through the crowd. This wasn't just a dog. It wasn't some random animal wandering through the devastation. This dog had purpose. It circled the wreckage, its eyes glued to one particular spot, where a home had collapsed in on itself. Its body was rigid, its stance unwavering, its bark growing more frantic with every passing second. Some of the rescuers began to shoo it away, thinking it was just a confused stray. A dog in mourning, perhaps, mourning the family that had lived there. After all, they had seen the devastation. They knew the chances of anyone still being alive were slim. The earth had taken so much already. What could this dog be searching for? But the dog wouldn't leave. It returned to the same spot again and again, pawing at the dirt and rubble, refusing to budge. Its eyes remained locked on the collapsed house, and its barking grew more desperate. "What is it doing?" one rescuer muttered. Another shook his head. "It's just an animal. It's confused, grieving like we all are." But the dog didn't stop. It didn't pause. It didn't go away. It was as if the dog had made a decision that there was something here worth saving, something buried beneath the wreckage, something worth fighting for. The rescue team continued to focus on other areas, ignoring the dog's persistent behavior. But even as they turned their attention away, there was something about the dog that wouldn't be dismissed. There was something deeply unsettling about how it refused to back down. Hours passed. The dog, undeterred, circled the rubble, claws digging into the dirt as though it was trying to unearth something, someone, beneath the layers of concrete and wood. Its fur was covered in dust, its paws bloodied from the constant scraping against the sharp edges of broken debris. Yet, it did not falter. It did not stop. It was relentless. It was as though the dog knew something they didn't. A young volunteer, weary and with his own doubts, watched the dog's movements from a distance. His gut told him something was wrong, but he couldn't pinpoint it. What was this dog so desperate for? What was it trying to tell them? He had seen animals wander through disasters before, but this was different. There was a purpose behind this dog's actions. Maybe it's not crazy, the young volunteer said to himself, then raised his voice to a nearby team member. What if it's right? What if it knows something? His words seemed to cut through the tension, and for the first time the rescuers looked at the dog not as a nuisance, but as something more, something different. Without further hesitation, they moved closer to the dog. The earth had already taken so much, but what if there was something still left to find? What if the dog, through its relentless digging and barking, had led them to something they might have otherwise missed? With renewed urgency, the team turned their attention to where the dog had been circling. They grabbed shovels and began to dig. The rubble was heavy. The weight of it was suffocating, both physically and emotionally. The silence of the landscape, once filled with life, was now only broken by the sound of heavy breathing and the scraping of metal against stone. But the dog was there, still watching, still waiting. Every few minutes, the dog would move closer to the pile of debris, then back away. It didn't bark. It didn't need to. Its eyes never left the wreckage. It was locked in, waiting for something. Its body was taut, its breathing slow but steady. Then something changed. A faint sound emerged from beneath the rubble. It wasn't barking. It wasn't shouting. It wasn't a cry of distress. It was the soft whimper of a child. The team froze. The dog's ears perked up. Its eyes widened with a kind of recognition. It had heard the same sound too. The rescuers didn't waste a second. They dug with new urgency, their hands moving faster now, their hearts pounding in their chests. The child's whimpers became clearer, louder, closer. Finally, someone shouted, "Here, here," as their hands grasped something small and fragile beneath the debris. And then, through the rubble, they pulled a dust-covered, barely breathing child into the open air. The dog barked one last time, a sharp, triumphant cry. Then, as though his work was done, he sat down, tail still, body relaxed, eyes watching the rescue team and the child. His job now complete. The child was weak, dehydrated, bruised and barely conscious, but the child was alive. And in that moment, the impossible became real. The house had collapsed more than 24 hours ago. The child had been buried under the debris for all that time. No one had thought survival was possible, but the dog had known, and the dog had never stopped believing. It was the greatest miracle they had ever witnessed. In that moment, they all understood, not just that the dog had found the child, but that the dog had never given up on him. As the team carried the child away to safety, the dog stayed behind. He watched them go. His job, his purpose, was fulfilled. There was no more to do. The villagers, who had watched in disbelief, began to gather around the rescue site. They whispered in awe. "Maybe it's an angel," one elderly woman said, crossing herself. Maybe it was meant to be. And so the villagers began to call the dog So, meaning hope in Burmese. And as So stayed by the boy's side, as the world began to heal around them, it became clear. So was not just a dog, he was a living symbol of hope. The dust still clung to the air, thick and oppressive, as the rescuers struggled to make their way through the wreckage. The mountainous villages of Myanmar, once peaceful and full of life, had been reduced to chaos. The aftershocks came, small tremors that rattled bones and hearts alike, reminding everyone that the earth could take more if it so wished. But in this moment, the rescuers focused on one thing: survival. There had to be more, they told themselves. More people, more lives left to save. Yet, as they sifted through the rubble of the tiny, isolated village, the despair settled like an unshakable fog. They had already lost hope. There were no signs of life here. The house that had collapsed into itself was one of the worst-hit structures, a complete disaster zone, with nothing left standing but twisted beams, crushed stone, and suffocating dust. It looked as though the earth had swallowed it whole. There were no cries, no signs of movement. As hours passed, and the team moved from one wrecked structure to another, something in the village began to quiet down. The group's morale, already battered from the intensity of the search, faltered further. What could they do now? What hope was there left? It seemed impossible. How many more times could they dig through the rubble before they faced the fact that not everyone could survive? The rescue teams had all but moved on, focusing on other areas where there was more hope, more signs that there might be something, someone, still alive. The cries of the people in nearby villages were louder, more urgent, and though the rescue teams were trained to dig through tragedy, even they couldn't ignore the reality that there were some areas where survival had simply been too unlikely. They turned away, unable to save every life, unwilling to waste precious time on what seemed like an empty grave. But then came the bark. It wasn't loud. It wasn't the desperate, frantic yelps of a trapped soul. It wasn't the noise of someone fighting to be found. It was the bark of a dog, low, persistent, insistent. It cut through the silence like a hot knife through butter, stirring the weary volunteers to pause in their tracks. They turned to look, confusion etched in their faces, unsure if they'd heard what they thought they had. They had been too tired, too numb, to hear anything outside the hum of their own exhaustion. But then they heard it again, a single, sharp bark, piercing the stifling silence. "Is that a dog?" one rescuer asked, his voice quiet and unsure. Another volunteer, tired beyond reason, shrugged. "Could be, but why would a dog still be here? All the pets were probably buried with their owners. They won't have survived this." They hesitated, but the barking didn't stop. It was relentless, and this time, it held something else, something that couldn't be ignored. It had urgency. It had meaning. The dog had found something, or someone. Against their instincts, the rescuers turned back toward the collapsed house, where the sound of the barking grew louder, more insistent, drawing them closer. With every bark, the dog's presence seemed to gather more force, as if the animal itself was determined to uncover something, to dig through the rubble no matter what. The others had moved on, but this dog was here for a reason. The team exchanged unsure glances, torn between disbelief and instinct. "Maybe it's just a stray," one of them said. "A dog just reacting to the chaos. Maybe it's lost." But the dog's focus never wavered. It wasn't running around aimlessly. It wasn't sniffing the ground for scraps. No, this dog had a mission. It stood in front of a pile of rubble, its body low, its eyes locked on the debris. Its bark grew louder, more frantic, the dog's small form trembling with urgency. The tail was stiff, rigid, almost as if it were warning them. This, whatever was buried here, was important. The rescuers moved cautiously toward the spot where the dog stood. At first, they were hesitant. The last thing they needed was to waste time on an animal's confused reaction. They had already seen too many animals wandering through the destruction. But the dog didn't stop. It scratched at the rubble. It pawed at the ground as if it were digging for something beneath the weight of concrete, twisted wood, and broken glass. A young volunteer, the one who had spoken up earlier, approached the dog with a mixture of confusion and curiosity. He knelt, resting one hand gently on the dog's back, feeling its trembling frame. For a moment, they just shared a quiet understanding. The dog wasn't backing down. Neither would he. "What if it's right?" the young man muttered, more to himself than to the others. "What if this dog knows something we don't?" With that thought, the team gathered together, no longer willing to dismiss the dog's behavior. Maybe it was their exhaustion, or maybe it was the sheer improbability of it all. But something inside them snapped. They knew that every second mattered. They needed to give it a shot, even if it seemed impossible. Together they knelt at the pile of rubble, shifting rocks, broken wood, and bricks aside with their hands and tools. The dog circled, stepping back and watching intently. Its eyes never left the spot where they were digging, its whole body taut with focus. It didn't bark again. It just waited. Its body language said everything. "Keep going. I'm telling you, there's something here." With every shovel of debris, the hope in the rescuers' hearts grew. What if this was it? What if the dog was right? Minutes passed. Each one seemed like an eternity. Then, as the pile began to clear, a faint sound reached their ears. A small, quiet whimper, so soft it could barely be heard over the shuffling of the team's hands and tools. It was the sound of a child, weak, barely audible, but unmistakable. Everyone froze. The dog stood motionless, its eyes wide, tail still. It didn't bark again, but the energy around it had changed. It had been right all along. There was a life buried beneath the rubble. The digging intensified. The rescuers worked frantically now, clearing the debris as fast as their hands could move. The air was thick with dust, the tension palpable. They could all hear the whimpering now, louder and more distinct. It was unmistakably the sound of a child in distress. And then, just as hope seemed to be slipping away, someone called out, "Here, here." With a final desperate effort, the rescuers lifted the last of the heavy concrete slab off the child's tiny form. A gasp rippled through the group. A small, barely breathing boy, no older than 3, lay trapped beneath the rubble. His body was covered in dust and grime, his skin pale and bruised, but his chest was rising and falling, faint but steady. The dog, its job now done, let out one last bark, short, sharp, and full of triumph, and sat down, as if to say, "I told you so." The rescuers stood in stunned silence, their eyes fixed on the child's frail form. How had he survived? How had he stayed alive for so long, buried beneath the wreckage, with no one coming to his aid? They had all believed there was no one left, but the dog had known. Somehow, it had known. The boy was weak, dehydrated, barely conscious, but he was alive. The team didn't speak. They didn't need to. In that moment, everything was clear. The dog had led them here. Without it, the child would have been left behind, forgotten. The boy's parents had not survived the earthquake. The child had been left alone, trapped under the wreckage, for more than 24 hours. His survival seemed like a miracle, impossible, yet undeniable. And standing in front of them, sitting beside the boy, was the dog. The stray dog that had refused to leave. The dog that had never given up. The dog that had saved a life. But the mystery didn't end there. The villagers had no idea where the dog had come from. It wasn't a pet of the village. It had no collar, no markings, no name. No one knew who the dog belonged to. Some believed it had been with the boy's family before the earthquake, but no one could say for sure. The villagers whispered. Some said the dog had been following the child around the village days before the earthquake, as if it had been drawn to him. Others believed it had been guided by instinct. Perhaps it was something more than a dog. "Maybe it's an angel," an elderly woman murmured, crossing herself as she stood beside the rescue scene. The villagers didn't know what to call the dog, but they knew one thing. It had brought hope when hope seemed lost. They called it Su, meaning hope in Burmese. And in that moment, as the boy was carried to safety, surrounded by rescuers and villagers alike, Su, the stray dog, the miracle dog, was no longer a nameless wanderer. He was the village's guardian, and he had given them the greatest gift of all life. In the aftermath of the rescue, the village was filled with a strange, quiet kind of hope. The boy was alive. It was a miracle. But for So, the dog who had led them to him, there was no celebration, no acknowledgement. He didn't bark joyously or wag his tail in the way that many dogs would after their work was done. No, So simply sat, watchful, still. His eyes remained locked on the scene around him, where rescuers and villagers had gathered, where the boy was being carried to safety. It was as if he knew his job was complete, and the weight of the world, heavy as it was, could finally be shared. But in the days that followed, as the village came to terms with its loss, the true depth of So's involvement began to sink in. The villagers were perplexed. The dog had appeared from nowhere. He wasn't a stray they had ever seen before. He didn't belong to any family in the village. He had no collar, no markings, no known history. At first, they assumed he was a pet that had been lost in the chaos of the earthquake. But as time passed, their questions grew. Where had he come from? How had he known? Why had he waited there, by the rubble, pawing at the ground and barking with such determination? The more they reflected, the more they realized that Sos had been there before. Some villagers recalled seeing him days earlier, wandering near the village, not just roaming aimlessly, but following the boy closely with an almost unnatural focus. But no one had thought to ask why. The villagers thought it strange, but no one had paid attention. Perhaps it was simply the aftermath of a disaster that distracted them all. So many homes were gone, so many lives lost. The boy had been the last to survive the wreckage. Everyone else had perished or been found too late. But this stray dog, Soz, had been there long before they had found the boy. It was clear to some that Soz wasn't just a dog. He was something more, something instinctual, perhaps something even mystical. There is something in his eyes, one villager said. Not like a normal dog's, like he knew, like he had a purpose. So's eyes never wavered, even as the villagers gathered around the boy, as doctors and volunteers worked to help him recover. Soz would occasionally nudge the boy with his nose, checking on him, sitting beside him like a faithful sentinel, never leaving his side. When the child was taken to the hospital for treatment, Soz sat at the door of the building, waiting patiently, tail resting still at his side, as if knowing the boy needed space but would come back to him. The villagers took notice. They watched as the dog, who had been just a stray wandering into their midst, became a symbol of hope for them all. They called him Soz, which meant hope in Burmese, a name that seemed to fit perfectly. It was as if the dog had been sent to remind them that hope, however fragile, could still be found in the most unexpected places. But Soz didn't care about the name. He didn't care about the attention. His focus remained solely on the boy. In the days following the boy's recovery, Soz stayed at his side. The child, though still weak and fragile, smiled every time the dog was near. It was a simple, pure smile, a sign of trust and connection. The boy, whose world had been turned upside down, was comforted only when Soz was there with him. The dog's presence, quiet and unassuming, filled a space in his heart that nothing else could. And in the moments when the villagers came to check on the boy, when they saw Soz sitting calmly by the bed, or walking beside the child, as if they had always been together, they felt the deep connection between the two. It was unspoken, but powerful. The villagers no longer saw Soz as just a stray. He was their guardian, their living symbol of survival in the wake of unimaginable destruction. One morning, after the boy had been safely stabilized, a local nurse, who had been helping with his treatment, pulled Claire, one of the volunteers, aside. "You know," she said softly, looking over at Soz, who was lying quietly on the floor, eyes still fixed on the boy. "We've seen this before. Not like this, but something similar. A few years ago, a dog like this appeared at the hospital after a different disaster. We called it Soz back then too. And it didn't leave." Claire raised an eyebrow, curiosity piqued. "You mean, it's the same dog?" The nurse smiled sadly. "No, I'm sure it's not. But sometimes, after a disaster like this, animals, they show up. They're not just pets. They're messengers in a way. They lead us. They help us. They keep us from giving up." Claire's mind swirled. Could it be that Soz was more than just a dog? A sense of purpose had driven him from the beginning. It was as if he had appeared out of nowhere to guide them to the boy, and once his mission was complete, he stayed, waiting by the boy's side, as a reminder that hope had survived. Days turned into weeks, and the boy's condition slowly improved. But the bond between him and Soz grew stronger with every passing hour. The boy had no memories of his parents, no clear recollections of the earthquake that had shaken his life apart. But he had Soz. The dog became his anchor in the storm. One day, the boy sat up in his hospital bed, his small hand reaching out toward Soz. He smiled weakly, his face still pale, but filled with a light that hadn't been there before. "Hope," the boy whispered, the word barely escaping his cracked lips. Soz stood and walked over to him, gently resting his head on the boy's lap, as if acknowledging his own name. It was then that the villagers began to talk about something else. They had seen miracles in their lives, but this was something different. There were no explanations. There was no logical reasoning behind how Soz had appeared just when he was needed most. The timing of it was too perfect. The instinct of the dog too strong. And the bond between the boy and the dog was undeniable. Some whispered, "Maybe Soz an angel." Others believed that Soz had been sent by the spirits to guide them out of the darkness. But one thing was clear. Sois was no longer just a stray dog. He had become part of the village's soul, part of their collective hope. He was a reminder that even in the aftermath of death and destruction, there could still be life, that even in the face of despair, there was always something worth fighting for. The boys' surviving relatives, though they hadn't known Sois before, began to visit. And when they saw how the dog had stayed by the boy's side through his recovery, they knew it was more than coincidence. This dog, this loyal, quiet soul, had saved the child's life. He had found him beneath the rubble, and now he would be part of their family. The villagers, moved by the bond between the boy and Sois, spoke of adopting the dog permanently. He had no collar when he arrived, but soon he would wear a collar of his own, a bright red one, with a tag that read, Hope. As Soi's story spread beyond the village, news outlets across the world began to pick it up. Headlines read, Stray dog leads rescuers to earthquake survivor, and dog saves life in Myanmar. After earthquake, donations poured in from around the globe, as people sent money, supplies and well wishes to the boy and Sois. The dog's loyalty and bravery became a symbol, and in a world torn apart by tragedy, Sois gave people something to believe in again, something to hold on to. The villagers didn't need anyone to tell them what Sois meant. They knew. They had felt it in their hearts, just as they had felt it when the boy was pulled from the rubble. Hope had been reborn. But Sois was more than just a story. He was a living testament to the power of instinct, love, and the unexplainable bonds that sometimes exist between us and the animals who choose to stand by our side. Despite the overwhelming gratitude and awe the villagers had for Sois, not everyone was ready to accept the miraculous nature of the dog's actions. While the boy's survival brought tears of joy and endless celebration, there was still a lingering doubt. The villagers who had experienced the devastation firsthand, those who had witnessed the collapse of their homes and the loss of their loved ones, struggled to embrace the idea that the dog had been more than just a dog. To some, So's actions were nothing more than a lucky coincidence. How could a dog without training, without any clear knowledge of where to go, possibly know to lead rescuers to the child? The earth had claimed so much, so quickly. Could a dog really have been the reason for the boy's survival? I think we're giving this dog too much credit, one of the villagers murmured, as he stood with a few others outside the makeshift shelter. It's just an animal, a dog following instinct, nothing more. There was a sense of resignation in his voice, a shadow of disbelief that clouded the joy. The disbelief wasn't entirely rooted in skepticism. It was the frustration that sometimes emerges when hope feels too fragile to cling to. These villagers had suffered so much. They had seen too many lives torn apart by the earthquake. Now even the miracle of the boy's survival was a bitter reminder of the fragility of life. For some, So's heroic actions felt too good to be true. They were afraid to believe in miracles because they were too used to losing. The villagers' doubts didn't go unnoticed. They were subtle at first, whispered behind closed doors, shared between neighbors, and in quiet conversations at the market. Maybe it was just chance, one would say. Maybe the dog just happened to be in the right place at the right time. Some even suggested the dog might have been looking for scraps, food or shelter, rather than anything to do with the child. But despite their skepticism, So didn't stop. His behavior didn't change. He stayed with the boy day after day, and never showed signs of restlessness or wandering. He was always there, a steady, quiet presence by the child's side. If the villagers doubted, the bond between Sois and the boy was undeniable. The child had begun to recover, his body weaker than it should have been for someone his age, but his smile, so fragile at first, began to grow, just as his connection with Sois grew stronger. Sois didn't leave the boy's side even for a moment. There was no sign of exhaustion in the dog. He was unrelenting in his devotion, and in return the boy, still too young to understand the magnitude of what had happened, began to trust the dog in a way that no one else could. Sois was his protector, his guardian, his anchor. No one else could provide that kind of comfort. The boy began to smile every time Sois approached, and every time the dog sat by his side, the boy's hand would instinctively reach for So's fur. But the villagers, though they respected the dog, continued to doubt. They couldn't understand how Sois could have known. They couldn't fathom how a stray, a dog with no collar and no master, had managed to lead them to a child who had been buried alive beneath the rubble. To them it was too much to accept. Could something as simple as instinct be the reason for such a miraculous discovery? Were they supposed to believe that a dog in the chaos of an earthquake had been able to find a tiny voice amidst the rubble? The younger volunteers, who had initially been moved by Zoe's actions, began to express their reservations as well. One of them, an older man named Tum, spoke up during one of the early morning recovery meetings. "It's all too convenient," he said, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "The dog just happened to be in the right place, barking at the right time, digging at the exact spot where the child was. We can't deny the boy is alive, but we can't give this dog credit for something so impossible." The tension in the room thickened, but no one spoke up immediately. Zoe's words rang in the air. Could they really call Zoe's actions a miracle? Or was it just a fluke? Was the dog's behavior a mere coincidence, a result of a stray's simple, instinctive search for shelter or companionship? It was a difficult question to answer, and as the team gathered to discuss the next phase of their rescue operation, Zoe continued to sit by the boy's side, never wavering in his watch. His presence remained constant, unyielding, as though he knew something no one else did. His eyes were sharp, his body still, waiting for something. What? No one could say. In the days that followed, some began to say that Zoe's actions weren't just random. They couldn't ignore the dog's refusal to leave, its tenacity in digging and barking with such intensity. No other animal had behaved like that. Other strays had wandered in and out of the debris, but none had shown such focused determination. None had known where to look. None had stayed so relentlessly, with no one to guide them. Could a dog really have done this without some deeper understanding of the situation? Could it have simply followed instinct, or had it known more? The longer they waited, the more the question loomed. Finally, as the villagers began to wrestle with their doubts, a new voice emerged. One of the young volunteers, a woman named Lynn, who had worked tirelessly alongside the rescue teams. Lynn had been with them from the very beginning, pulling survivors from rubble, and offering what little comfort she could in the face of overwhelming loss. She was exhausted, emotionally drained, but when she spoke, her voice was clear and firm. "I think Zoe knows something we don't," she said, her eyes focused on the dog, who sat just beyond the group, watching them. "I've watched him. He doesn't just bark, he doesn't just dig, he's waiting for something. He's trying to tell us something. He knew." Lynn's words were met with silence. Her certainty was unsettling, and yet, as they looked at Zoe, sitting with his watchful eyes, it was hard to ignore the undeniable connection he had with the child. Even as the doubts persisted, one thing was clear. Zoe had been the one to lead them to the child. Whether by instinct or something else, he had brought the rescuers to the right place. He had known where to go. The doubts continued to linger in the background, but for the first time, there was a shift. Some villagers began to see Zoe not as a stray, but as something more, something extraordinary. They began to whisper amongst themselves, "Maybe he is something more. Maybe he is a guardian angel." And as the days turned into weeks, as the boy continued to recover, and Zoe remained by his side, the villagers' hearts softened. Slowly they began to see that it wasn't just a fluke, it wasn't just a coincidence. The dog had saved a life. It was impossible to deny that. Zoe's presence in the village became a source of inspiration and hope. He was no longer just a stray. He had become something far greater. He was a symbol, a living embodiment of survival, of resilience, of the unknown forces that sometimes work behind the scenes to bring about the impossible. In the weeks that followed, more people began to visit the village, not just for the boy's story, but for Zoe's. They came from all over Myanmar, from distant cities, to meet the dog who had saved a life when no one else could. They came to see for themselves the dog that had become a hero. But even as the world began to recognize Zoe's actions, he remained the same quiet, watchful dog. He didn't bark for attention. He didn't look for praise. He stayed true to his purpose. His loyalty remained with the boy, his devotion unwavering. And so the story of the dog who saved a life continued to grow, spreading across the country and eventually around the world. Zoe had become a symbol of hope and resilience in the face of unimaginable loss, and his place in the hearts of the villagers, and in the heart of the boy he had saved, would never be forgotten. Despite the doubts and the whispered questions, the bond between So and the boy grew deeper with each passing day. As the boy slowly recovered, his strength returning with each new sunrise, So remained by his side. Their connection was undeniable. The boy, whose name was Hong, had found comfort in So in ways no one else could provide. The trauma of the earthquake, the loss of his parents, the shock of surviving beneath the rubble, none of it could be truly healed by medicine or food alone. It was So, the dog who had found him when no one else had, that brought him the peace he so desperately needed. As Ong's physical wounds healed, his emotional scars remained, though he didn't fully understand them. He would wake up in the middle of the night, trembling, the sounds of the earth's tremors still echoing in his mind. But every time he looked up, So was there, lying beside him, his steady presence offering comfort. It was clear to anyone who saw them that the dog wasn't just an animal to Hong. He was a companion, a protector, a guardian angel in the form of a black mutt, with eyes full of wisdom and an unshakable loyalty. But it wasn't just the boy who found solace in So's presence. The villagers, too, had begun to see the dog in a different light. They still whispered about the miracle he had brought, but there was also a growing sense of awe surrounding him. Some even said So was more than a dog. They believed that somehow the dog had been sent to guide them in their darkest hour, to help them find the hope they had lost amidst the rubble. And while their doubts still lingered, there was no denying that So had given them something they hadn't had before, the belief that miracles could still happen, even after the earth had torn their world apart. But as much as the villagers wanted to believe in So's divinity, there were still many who questioned the dog's actions. They didn't understand how an animal, a stray with no known owner, had been able to lead the rescue team to Hong. They asked themselves, was it instinct? Was it sheer luck? Or had the dog simply found the child in the same way an animal might find food or shelter? It was easy to dismiss the miracle as something ordinary, something that happened by chance. But So didn't care about the questions. So didn't need the villagers' approval or belief. He had done his part. He had found Hong, and in the process, he had shown the world that even the smallest, most unlikely of heroes could make the biggest difference. The villagers may have doubted, but So remained steadfast. He had no need to prove himself. His actions spoke for themselves. As days passed, So's role in Ong's recovery became more and more apparent. The boy was still young, too young to truly understand the magnitude of what had happened. But he had already learned one thing. So was his constant, and for the first time since the earthquake, Hong felt safe. The nightmares that had plagued him began to fade, and though he would never forget the trauma, he began to heal. So was there for every step of that journey. He never left the boy's side, never strayed too far, always present, always watching over him. But as the days turned into weeks, and the recovery efforts continued, the villagers started to realize something else about So. He wasn't just a dog who had been in the right place at the right time. He wasn't just a dog who had helped rescue Ong from the wreckage. So was something more. He was a silent, unwavering presence that had carried the weight of an entire community's grief. He had been there when everything else had fallen apart, and in his own quiet way, So had brought them all back together. Yet, despite the growing respect for So, there were still whispers of doubt. Some villagers still didn't understand how the dog could have possibly known where to look, how he could have known that Ong was alive beneath the rubble. Was it just instinct? Was it simply luck? They couldn't understand it, and they didn't want to. They didn't want to admit that something so unexplainable had happened in their own village. But then, one day, as the team of rescuers moved through the wreckage again, a new discovery was made, one that would turn their doubts into certainty. It started with So. The dog had been standing near the site of the collapsed house again, barking. At first, the rescuers thought he was simply reacting to the familiar destruction, to the same spot where Ong had been found. But So's behavior was different this time. He wasn't just barking, he was digging. At first, the rescuers thought he was just searching for food, or perhaps he had become disoriented, seeking shelter in the wreckage. But there was something urgent in his movements, something that couldn't be ignored. He scratched at the ground with intensity, his paws tearing through the debris as though he were looking for something. "Not again," one of the volunteers muttered, thinking it was the dog reacting to the same spot. But Soe wouldn't stop. He kept digging, his body trembling with determination. His eyes locked onto the same spot, the place where Ong had been found. His claws scraped at the rubble, and his barks became more frantic. The villagers gathered around, watching the dog with growing concern. What was he doing? Why was he digging? Had he found something else? As the team started to investigate, they paused, realizing that something felt different this time. The urgency in Soa's actions, his refusal to stop digging, it was unlike anything they had seen before. Could there be something else under there? One rescuer asked. Another survivor. The others exchanged wary looks. It seemed unlikely. They had already combed through this area, already found Ong. What more could there be? But despite their reservations, they knew they couldn't ignore Soe. The dog had led them to the boy once before. What if, just maybe, it wasn't just a fluke? Without hesitation, the team started digging again, following Soa's movements. It wasn't long before they hit something. At first, it was just a faint sound like the soft tapping of a distant echo, a muffled cry, a faint whimper. "Is that?" The volunteer trailed off, his heart racing. Soe stepped back, watching them intently, still standing guard over the pile of rubble. His eyes never left the area as they carefully removed debris, and the faint whimper turned into a more distinct sound, a human voice. One rescuer's hand touched something small, something fragile, and then they pulled out another survivor. This time, a young girl, no older than 5, her body bruised, battered, but still alive. The village gasped. The dog had led them to another survivor. Soe had known. Somehow, some way, Soe had understood that there was still life beneath the rubble. He had refused to give up, even when everyone else had. And once again, Soe proved that even in the most unimaginable circumstances, the smallest glimmer of hope could still shine through. The young girl, barely conscious, was carefully carried away to safety. As she was taken to the medical tent, Soe followed behind, walking quietly beside the rescuers, as though he had known the whole time that another miracle was about to unfold. The villagers who had once doubted, now understood. There was no other explanation. Soe wasn't just a dog, he was a guardian, he was a miracle. And as they looked around at the devastation that surrounded them, the rubble that still lay untouched, they knew that Soe had not only saved lives, he had given them back something even more precious: hope. Despite the doubts and the whispered questions, the bond between Soe and the boy grew deeper with each passing day. As the boy slowly recovered, his strength returning with each new sunrise, Soe remained by his side. Their connection was undeniable. The boy, whose name was Awang, had found comfort in Soe in ways no one else could provide. The trauma of the earthquake, the loss of his parents, the shock of surviving beneath the rubble, none of it could be truly healed by medicine or food alone. It was Soe, the dog, who had found him when no one else had, that brought him the peace he so desperately needed. As Awang's physical wounds healed, his emotional scars remained, though he didn't fully understand them. He would wake up in the middle of the night, trembling, the sounds of the earth's tremors still echoing in his mind. But every time he looked up, Soe was there, lying beside him, his steady presence offering comfort. It was clear to anyone who saw them that the dog wasn't just an animal to Wang. He was a companion, a protector, a guardian angel in the form of a black mutt, with eyes full of wisdom and an unshakable loyalty. But it wasn't just the boy who found solace in Soe's presence. The villagers, too, had begun to see the dog in a different light. They still whispered about the miracle he had brought, but there was also a growing sense of awe surrounding him. Some even said Soe was more than a dog. They believed that somehow the dog had been sent to guide them in their darkest hour, to help them find the hope they had lost amidst the rubble. And while their doubts still lingered, there was no denying that Soe had given them something they hadn't had before: the belief that miracles could still happen, even after the earth had torn their world apart. But as much as the villagers wanted to believe in Soe's divinity, there were still many who questioned the dog's actions. They didn't understand how an animal, a stray with no known owner, had been able to lead the rescue team to Wang. They asked themselves, was it instinct? Was it sheer luck? Or had the dog simply found the child in the same way an animal might find food or shelter? It was easy to dismiss the miracle as something ordinary, something that happened by chance. But Soe didn't care about the questions. Soe didn't need the villagers' approval or belief. He had done his part. He had found a Wang, and in the process, he had shown the world that even the smallest, most unlikely of heroes could make the biggest difference. The villagers may have doubted, but Soe remained steadfast. He had no need to prove himself. His actions spoke for themselves. As days passed, Soe's role in Ong's recovery became more and more apparent. The boy was still young, too young to truly understand the magnitude of what had happened, but he had already learned one thing: Soe was his constant. And for the first time since the earthquake, Wang felt safe. The nightmares that had plagued him began to fade, and though he would never forget the trauma, he began to heal. Soe was there for every step of that journey. He never left the boy's side, never strayed too far, always present, always watching over him. But as the days turned into weeks, and the recovery efforts continued, the villagers started to realize something else about Soe. He wasn't just a dog who had been in the right place at the right time. He wasn't just a dog who had helped rescue Ong from the wreckage. Soe was something more. He was a silent, unwavering presence that had carried the weight of an entire community's grief. He had been there when everything else had fallen apart, and in his own quiet way Soe had brought them all back together. Yet, despite the growing respect for Soe, there were still whispers of doubt. Some villagers still didn't understand how the dog could have possibly known where to look, how he could have known that Ongs was alive beneath the rubble. Was it just instinct? Was it simply luck? They couldn't understand it, and they didn't want to. They didn't want to admit that something so unexplainable had happened in their own village. But then, one day, as the team of rescuers moved through the wreckage again, a new discovery was made, one that would turn their doubts into certainty. It started with Soe. The dog had been standing near the site of the collapsed house again, barking. At first the rescuers thought he was simply reacting to the familiar destruction, to the same spot where Ongs had been found. But Soe's behavior was different this time. He wasn't just barking, he was digging. At first the rescuers thought he was just searching for food, or perhaps he had become disoriented, seeking shelter in the wreckage. But there was something urgent in his movements, something that couldn't be ignored. He scratched at the ground with intensity, his paws tearing through the debris, as though he were looking for something. "Not again," one of the volunteers muttered, thinking it was the dog reacting to the same spot. But Soe wouldn't stop. He kept digging, his body trembling with determination. His eyes locked onto the same spot, the place where Ongs had been found. His claws scraped at the rubble, and his barks became more frantic. The villagers gathered around, watching the dog with growing concern. What was he doing? Why was he digging? Had he found something else? As the team started to investigate, they paused, realizing that something felt different this time. The urgency in Soe's actions, his refusal to stop digging, it was unlike anything they had seen before. Could there be something else under there? One rescuer asked. Another survivor. The others exchanged wary looks. It seemed unlikely. They had already combed through this area, already found Ongs. What more could there be? But despite their reservations, they knew they couldn't ignore Soe. The dog had led them to the boy once before. What if, just maybe, it wasn't just a fluke? Without hesitation, the team started digging again, following Soe's movements. It wasn't long before they hit something. At first it was just a faint sound, like the soft tapping of a distant echo, a muffled cry, a faint whimper. "Is that?" The volunteer trailed off, his heart racing. Soe stepped back, watching them intently, still standing guard over the pile of rubble. His eyes never left the area, as they carefully removed debris, and the faint whimper turned into a more distinct sound, a human voice. One rescuer's hand touched something small, something fragile, and then they pulled out another survivor. This time, a young girl, no older than 5, her body bruised, battered, but still alive. The village gasped. The dog had led them to another survivor. Soe had known. Somehow, some way, Soe had understood that there was still life beneath the rubble. He had refused to give up, even when everyone else had. And once again, Soe proved that even in the most unimaginable circumstances, the smallest glimmer of hope could still shine through. The young girl, barely conscious, was carefully carried away to safety. As she was taken to the medical tent, Soe followed behind, walking quietly beside the rescuers as though he had known the whole time that another miracle was about to unfold. The villagers who had once doubted, now understood. There was no other explanation. Soe wasn't just a dog, he was a guardian. He was a miracle. And as they looked around at the devastation that surrounded them, the rubble that still lay untouched, they knew that Soe had not only saved lives, he had given them back something even more precious: hope. The moment the rescuers pulled the young girl from beneath the rubble, the air seemed to change. It wasn't just the weight of another survivor, though that in itself was an incredible blessing. It was something else, a shift in the way the village viewed Paws, the stray dog who had become their miracle. As the girl was carefully carried to the medical tent, her small form bruised and battered, the villagers watched in awe. She was alive, but it didn't make sense. It couldn't. How could a dog, just a stray dog, know to dig in the exact spot where a life still existed? How had Cell, without a collar, without a master, with nothing but instinct, found her? The rescue team worked quickly, their hands moving with precision, their faces tight with the strain of exhaustion and disbelief. No one could truly explain it. There was no simple answer to how So, an animal with no formal training, had led them to not one but two survivors, both of whom had been buried beneath the ruins for over 24 hours. No one thought survival was possible under such conditions. But somehow, So had defied the odds. As the team gathered around the young girl, making sure she was stable and administering fluids to her weakened body, So sat a few feet away, watching intently. His eyes, once sharp with urgency, now softened with something else, satisfaction perhaps, or maybe relief. His work was far from done, but for the moment, the dog allowed himself to rest, his body no longer tense, his gaze no longer locked on the rubble as it had been just moments before. The dog's job had been completed, but what remained in the air was a profound sense of wonder. The villagers, who had been skeptical at first, began to exchange looks. How could they deny what they had just witnessed? So had led them to the boy, then to the girl, both found alive after the devastation of the earthquake. The odds had been stacked against them. The odds had been stacked against everyone, except So. He knew, one elderly villager said softly. He knew where to look. As the young girl was transferred to a medical facility, So remained in the background, silently watching the crowd. His job had always been with Ung, the boy he had saved. But now the village had begun to see him as something else. He wasn't just a stray dog. He was a guide, a protector, a beacon of hope in the midst of tragedy. So's actions could not be explained by logic, by science, or by anything they had ever known. There was no reasonable explanation for how a stray dog, one with no prior training, no past relationships with the village, had acted with such incredible precision. His actions had been driven by something deeper, something primal. It was as if the dog had understood more than they could ever know. He had led them to Ung, and then, once again, to the girl. Both were living proof that hope had not vanished from the earth, even when everything else seemed to crumble away. I don't know how, Len, one of the young volunteers, said quietly to herself, shaking her head as she watched So sit, watching over the village. But I believe that So, he knew something we didn't. The others nodded. They had seen it too. There was no explanation, no logical way to understand what had happened. But they had witnessed it firsthand. So had led them to two lives that otherwise would have been lost. He had shown them what could still survive after everything else had fallen apart. In the days that followed, the village started to heal, though the scars of the earthquake were deeply etched into the landscape and the hearts of those who had witnessed the devastation. But there was also a sense of something new, something powerful that had begun to take root. It was hope. It was faith. It was the belief that miracles could still happen, even in the wake of disaster. And it was all because of So, the dog who had appeared from nowhere and refused to leave until his work was done. The villagers began to gather near the rubble where So had first led them to where the first miracle had occurred. It had become a symbol of resilience, a physical reminder that even in the face of unimaginable loss, there was always something worth saving. So was no longer just a stray dog. He had become a symbol of the village's strength, a testament to the belief that survival could come in the most unlikely forms. One afternoon, the village elders who had been silently observing So's behavior since the rescue gathered to discuss what should be done next. They had seen the dog's actions and they had seen the boy's recovery. But there was still something about So that they couldn't explain. He is not just a dog, one of the elders said, his voice low but steady. I believe he is a guardian, a guide sent to us in our darkest hour. The others nodded, their faces reflecting the gravity of his words. The village had always been small, isolated from the rest of the world. They had lived with simplicity, but they had also lived with a deep connection to the land. And now, they felt that same connection with So, the dog who had come from nowhere and had become everything they needed. He saved the boy, another elder added, and now the girl. He has brought us something we did not expect. Hope, and for that we must honor him. A decision was made that day. So would no longer be a stray wandering the streets. He would become part of the village, a member of the community that had learned to rely on him, trust in him, and believe in his unspoken understanding of what needed to be done. As they approached So, the dog remained still, his eyes never leaving the elders. He didn't need to be coaxed. He didn't need to be convinced. He had already chosen the boy. And now, he had chosen the village. The villagers decided to give So a permanent place in their lives. They created a collar for him, bright red, with a tag that read Hope. It was a symbol not just for So but for everything the dog had brought to their village. It was a symbol of their survival, their resilience, and their belief that even when the world seemed to fall apart, there was always hope to be found. So accepted his new role with the same calmness he had shown from the very beginning. He didn't bark for attention. He didn't seek out praise. He simply stayed close to who had come to love him as a guardian, as a friend. And for So, that was enough. He had done what he had come to do. He had saved a life. And now, he was part of a new family. He was part of the village that had learned to believe in him. As time passed, the story of So's heroism spread beyond the village. News outlets picked up the story. People from across Myanmar, and even from other countries, came to hear about the stray dog who had led rescuers to 2 survivors, a child and a girl, who had been trapped beneath the rubble for more than a day. Donations flooded in. Supplies, food, medical care, and offers of help for the village's rebuilding efforts all came pouring in. But it wasn't just the physical support that touched the villagers. It was the outpouring of love, hope, and admiration for So, the dog who had become a hero. The boy, began to recover fully. His scars, both physical and emotional, began to heal. And as he grew stronger, he was never without So. The dog remained his constant companion, walking with him, standing beside him, offering him the comfort that no one else could. One day, as the village started rebuilding their homes and lives, they erected a small statue at the center of the village. It was a child and a dog, side by side, captured in a moment of peace. The inscription read, "Hope lives here." And so, in the heart of the village, where the earth had trembled and torn their world apart, So became not just a hero, but a living symbol of what could survive after devastation. He became a reminder that even in the worst of times, there was always something worth fighting for. So's legacy, though simple, was undeniable. His quiet devotion to had changed everything. It had saved lives, it had rekindled hope, and it had reminded everyone that love and loyalty could transcend the most terrible of tragedies. As the months passed since the earthquake, the village began to rebuild, not just their homes, but their spirits. The devastation was still fresh in their minds, and there were no easy answers to the pain they had endured. But amidst the wreckage of broken buildings and lost lives, a new sense of unity emerged, a bond strengthened by survival and hope And at the heart of it all was Sose. The stray dog who had once been a nameless wanderer was now the symbol of everything the village had survived. The villagers no longer saw him as just a dog. He had become something more, a protector, a guardian, a living testament to resilience and faith. And as the days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, So's role in the village only grew more significant. At first, the villagers had hesitated. Sose had appeared from nowhere, and many had doubted the extraordinary nature of his actions. But now there was no question. He had saved lives. He had found Ang, the boy buried beneath the rubble, and then he had found the young girl, hidden in the same spot. And in doing so, Sose had done what no human had been able to. He had brought hope when there seemed to be none. It wasn't just the boy who had been saved by Sose. The villagers too had been saved, in a way they hadn't expected. Sose had shown them that there was something to believe in, even when everything seemed lost. And through it all, Sose never sought attention. He didn't bark for praise. He didn't look for affection. He simply stayed by Ang's side, quietly fulfilling the role he had taken on. He was a silent hero, a steady presence in a world that had been turned upside down. One morning, as the sun broke through the clouds, casting a soft glow over the village, a visitor arrived. He was a man from a nearby town, someone who had heard the story of the stray dog who had saved a child's life. He had come to see the dog for himself, to learn about the miracle that had unfolded in the wake of the disaster. "I've heard so much about Sose," the man said, his voice filled with awe. "People are calling him a hero, a savior. I want to see him with my own eyes." The villagers nodded in quiet agreement. Sose had become a symbol of hope, not just for them but for others as well. News of the dog's heroism had spread far beyond the village's borders, and now people were coming to witness the miracle firsthand. Sose sat by Ang's side as the man approached, his eyes calm, his posture relaxed but alert. There was no fanfare, no excitement. Sose simply watched the man with his steady gaze, as if he knew exactly why he had come. The boy, Ang, was resting against the wall, his small hand resting on So's back. The man crouched down, extending a hand toward Sos, who regarded him with quiet patience. Slowly, Sose's tail began to wag, just once, as if acknowledging the visitor's presence. "You've heard the story, haven't you?" the man said, his voice soft. "How this dog led rescuers to 2 survivors. How he found them in the rubble, saved their lives." The villagers nodded, their faces filled with pride. It was a story they had told many times, but it never lost its impact. It was a story of survival, of faith, of a bond between a boy and a dog that transcended the impossible. The man's eyes softened. "It's incredible. To think that such a small act of kindness, such a simple animal, could do so much." Sose remained still, his body resting beside Ang's. He didn't need to do anything. He didn't need to prove himself. His presence was enough. And as the man stroked So's head, the dog's tail wagged again, this time a little faster, as if he understood that he had fulfilled his purpose. The miracle was no longer about what Sose had done, but what he had become. The visitors who came after the man were more than just curious onlookers. They were people who had heard the story of Sose and were moved by the dog's actions. They came from all walks of life, from other villages, from cities, and even from across the country. They brought food, they brought supplies, they brought donations for the rebuilding effort. But most importantly, they brought a renewed sense of hope, not just for the village, but for the entire country. Sose's story became a beacon for others. People came to see the dog, who had saved a life, and in doing so had saved so many others. The villagers who had once doubted, who had questioned whether miracles could still happen, began to embrace the truth of So's actions. They saw him not as a stray, but as a symbol of everything they had fought to hold on to: hope, faith, and the belief that even in the darkest times, there was always light. And through it all, Sose remained the same. He never changed, his loyalty to Ang never wavered. His presence was a constant, a steady force that kept the village grounded. Sosei had saved lives, but now he was doing something else. He was teaching the villagers to believe in themselves again. As time passed, the boy Ung grew stronger. The scars of the earthquake remained, of course. There was no erasing the loss, no undoing the destruction that had torn through the village. But Ung was no longer just a survivor. He was thriving, supported by the love of Sos, the dog who had stayed with him through it all. And Sos, he remained by Ung's side, a silent sentinel, never needing recognition, never seeking praise. The bond between the boy and the dog was unbreakable. It was a bond forged in the fires of tragedy and solidified through survival. The villagers began to see that Sos wasn't just a dog who had rescued a child. He had become the embodiment of everything they had lost, and everything they had found again. He was their symbol of survival, of love, of the power of instinct and loyalty. And when the village was finally rebuilt, when the homes were restored, when the last pieces of debris had been cleared, the villagers gathered together to honor Sos in a way they had never imagined. They built a small shrine in the center of the village, a place where people could come to reflect, to give thanks, and to remember what had been lost, and what had been found again. The shrine was simple, but beautiful. It featured a statue of a child and a dog, side by side, captured in a moment of peace. The inscription read, "Hope lives here." It was a tribute to Sos, but it was also a tribute to the village itself. It was a reminder that no matter how dark the world seemed, there was always a way to find the light. As the years passed, Sosei continued to walk the village streets. He wore a bright red collar now, with a tag that read, "Hope." He was no longer a stray. He was a member of the community, a beloved figure who had saved a life, a dog who had given them back the one thing they had lost, faith. And every time someone doubted the power of instinct, or the strength of love, they remembered the day the earth trembled, and a dog rose from the ruins to save a life. Sosei's story spread beyond the village. News outlets across the world picked it up. People shared the story of the dog, who had saved the child beneath the rubble, and in doing so had saved the village itself. Donations poured in. Volunteers came to help with the rebuilding, and through it all, Sosei remained a symbol of hope, standing tall in the face of adversity. A reminder that sometimes, the smallest among us can make the biggest difference. Years later, when people asked the villagers about Sos, they would tell the same story: how the dog had come from nowhere, how he had saved Ong's life, and how he had become the village's hero. They would tell the world that Sos wasn't just a stray, he was the heart of their community. He was the living proof that miracles still happened, and that hope could still be found, even when it seemed impossible. Sosei had become more than just a dog. He had become a legend. Years passed since So had emerged from the rubble of the earthquake, and though the scars of the disaster had slowly faded, So remained the steadfast heart of the village. The world had moved on. The immediate crisis had passed, and the community was rebuilding, not just with bricks and mortar, but with a sense of renewed purpose. But through it all, So continued to walk the village streets, his presence as quiet and constant as ever, never seeking attention, never demanding the praise that so many tried to offer him. He was, and always had been, a silent hero. There were no parades for So, no grand speeches or medals pinned to his collar. There was no need for them. The villagers knew what he had done. They knew that the dog who had once wandered in as a stray had given them back their hope, their faith, and their belief that even in the most devastating of circumstances, there was always something worth saving. So didn't care about recognition or reward. He simply cared about Ang, the boy he had rescued, and the village he had saved in his quiet, unassuming way. Ang had grown into a strong, vibrant young boy. His once fragile body, weakened by the earthquake and the trauma he had endured, was now filled with the energy of youth. He spent his days running through the village, playing with other children, helping his neighbors, and always by So's side. The dog had become his protector, his companion, and his guardian angel. No matter where Aang went, So was there. Whether they were helping to rebuild a house, or simply enjoying a walk through the village, So was there, his calm presence providing comfort to Aang and everyone around him. As Aang grew older, So's role in his life became even more significant. The boy, now a young man, had developed into someone the village could look up to. He was determined, compassionate, and driven by a deep sense of gratitude for the dog who had saved him. He knew that So's actions had changed his life forever, and he was determined to honor that gift. He worked alongside the villagers, not only helping to rebuild the physical structures of the community, but also helping to rebuild the emotional ties that had been broken by the earthquake. He had learned the true meaning of survival and hope from So, and he wanted to share that knowledge with others. But So, as always, remained the quiet figure in the background. He didn't need to be recognized for his work. He didn't need to be praised. His purpose had been fulfilled the moment he had saved Aang's life, and now he was content to watch the boy grow, to see the village flourish, and to continue being the steady, unshakable presence they had all come to rely on. So's loyalty to Aang was unwavering. The bond between them was unbreakable, and it was clear to everyone who saw them that they were more than just a boy and his dog. They were partners in survival, in life, in hope. The dog had taught Aang everything he knew about resilience, about loyalty, and about love. And Aang in turn had given So the one thing that no one could ever take away: a home. So no longer wandered the streets as a stray. He had found his place in the world by Aang's side, with the people who loved him, who understood him, and who would never let him go. As the years went by, So's reputation grew, though not in the way that one might expect for a hero. The story of his miraculous rescue, the way he had led the rescue team to Aang, and then to the young girl, spread throughout Myanmar and beyond. People came from all over the country, and even from other parts of the world, to hear about the dog who had saved 2 lives when no one else could. News outlets ran stories about him, documentaries were made, but for So none of that mattered. He didn't seek the limelight. He didn't care about fame or recognition. He had done what he needed to do. He had saved lives, and now he was content to rest, knowing that his work was complete. The village itself began to flourish, buoyed by the new sense of community that had developed in the wake of the disaster. The earthquake, though devastating, had brought the villagers closer together. They worked together to rebuild, to heal, to move forward. And at the center of it all was So. He was the glue that held them together, the silent force that had given them the strength to keep going. Every day the villagers would see him walking the streets, his red collar gleaming in the sunlight, his tag reading hope, and every time they saw him, they were reminded of the miracle that had changed their lives. But So's story didn't just live in the memories of the villagers. It became a symbol for all who heard it, a symbol of survival, of resilience, of the power of love and loyalty. People began to look to So as an example of what was possible when we refuse to give up, when we stand by each other in the darkest of times. His story resonated with people across the world. It reminded them that no matter how broken the world may seem, there was always a chance for healing, for redemption, for hope. And as the years went by, So's legacy grew. Statues were erected in his honor. The shrine that the villagers had built in the center of the village, where So had once led the rescuers to Aang, became a place of pilgrimage for those who sought inspiration, for those who believed in the power of love and loyalty to save lives. Visitors from all corners of the world came to see the place where So had worked his miracle, to witness the bond between boy and dog that had changed everything. So's life was simple, but it was filled with purpose. He didn't need to do anything more. He had already given everything he could. And as he walked through the village streets, tail wagging, head held high, there was a quiet understanding among the villagers. So was no longer just a dog. He was a hero, not because of the fame he had earned, but because of the lives he had saved, and the love he had shared. He had shown them all that, even in the darkest moments, there was always light. And in So's eyes that light would never fade. One evening, as the sun set over the rebuilt village, Aang sat on the porch of his home, So by his side. The dog had grown older, his fur more grayed than it had been, his body slower, but his presence was as strong as ever. Aang looked down at him, his heart full of gratitude, his mind filled with memories of all that Soe had done for him, for the village, for everyone. Soe had given him life. He had given him hope when there had been none. "You saved me, Soe," Aang whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved all of us." Soe turned his head toward the boy, his eyes calm, his tail giving a small, slow wag. And in that moment, Aang knew that Soe didn't need to hear those words. The dog had already known. He had always known. He had saved them because that was his purpose. Quietly, without expectation, without the need for recognition, he had given everything he had, and in return he had received something even greater, the love and devotion of a boy, of a village, and of a world that had learned to believe in miracles once again. And so as the years continued to pass, Soe's place in the village remained unshakable. He was the silent hero, the one who had shown them all the power of love, the strength of loyalty, and the quiet courage that comes when we choose to stay, when we choose to believe, when we choose to save. Soe's story was not just the story of a stray dog. It was the story of the world itself, the story of survival, of hope, of resilience, in the face of unimaginable loss. And as long as Soe walked the streets of the village, as long as his red collar gleamed in the sun, the villagers would remember. They would remember the day the earth trembled, and the dog who rose from the ruins to save a life. As the years passed, the village settled into a rhythm. The rubble left by the earthquake was now nothing more than a memory, replaced by newly built homes, new paths, and fresh gardens that began to bloom in the wake of the devastation. The sky above was the same clear blue it had always been, and the gentle hum of life began to fill the air once more. Yet, even as the world moved on, there was something timeless about the way the villagers carried themselves now, something that came from the lessons they had learned, the strength they had found within themselves, and the deep bond they had formed with So. For So, the stray dog who had become their savior, life had never been about accolades or recognition. He had never sought out fame or glory. He had simply done what was in his heart. He had saved lives when the world seemed ready to give up on them. And in return, he had become a part of the village's soul, a living symbol of the miracle they had all witnessed. As So walked through the village, his red collar gleaming in the sun, people smiled and waved. He wasn't just a dog anymore. He was a living legacy, one of hope, of resilience, and of the quiet strength that can come from unexpected places. But as all things do, the inevitable passage of time came to So as well. His once sleek black coat had begun to gray, and his gait had slowed with age. His tail, once so lively, now wagged more slowly, but it still held the same warmth, the same quiet assurance. His bond with Ong, the boy he had saved, had only deepened as the years went on. Ong was no longer the frail child who had once been buried beneath the rubble. He was now a young man, strong and filled with the same quiet strength that So had shown. They were partners in life, and Ong had come to learn that So was not just his protector, he was his heart. Ong, now in his late teens, had taken it upon himself to help rebuild the village, to teach the younger generation what So had taught him. He spoke of loyalty, of survival, of never giving up even when the world felt like it was crumbling. He told the children of the village about the dog who had saved him, who had given him the strength to go on, and who had never once left his side. He spoke of the quiet courage it took for Soa to lead the rescuers to him, to stand by his side as the world trembled around them, and to show the villagers that even in the darkest times hope could still bloom. But in the quiet moments, in the stillness of the evening, Ong would sit with Soa stroking the dog's fur, feeling the steady rhythm of his breath, and remember the bond they shared. It was a bond that went beyond mere companionship. It was a bond forged in the fires of disaster, of loss, of survival, and of the unbreakable love between a boy and his dog. Ong knew that So was growing older, that the time they had left together was limited, but he didn't dwell on it. He cherished every moment, every step they took together, every moment of peace they shared. So had given him life, and in return, he would make sure the dog knew that he was loved, every day. One evening, As the sun began to set, and the sky was painted with soft hues of orange and pink, Ong sat on the porch, his legs stretched out before him, Soa lying beside him, his head resting on Ong's lap. The dog's breathing was slow, but steady, his eyes half closed as he took in the quiet of the evening. The village was peaceful, the sounds of children playing in the distance, blending with the soft rustling of the trees in the breeze. Ong looked down at So, his heart swelling with a mixture of love and sadness. "You saved me," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved us all." So's ears twitched slightly, but he didn't move. There was no need for words. So had always understood him, always known what was in his heart. The bond between them was unspoken, but stronger than anything Ong had ever known. It was a bond that had been built on trust, on survival, on the quiet love that can only come from true loyalty. As the night settled in, the village around them grew quiet. The stars above twinkled, casting a soft glow over the land. Ong and Soa stayed on the porch, wrapped in the silence that only came with shared understanding. Time seemed to stand still, and in that moment, everything felt perfect, everything felt whole. But the next day, as the sun rose over the village, the inevitable truth that Ong had known deep down in his heart came. So was not the dog he had once been. His steps were slower now, and his breathing, though steady, seemed labored. His once vibrant eyes now held a softness, a weariness that spoke of the years that had passed. Ong knew that So was growing old, that their time together was coming to an end. But even in the face of that truth, there was no fear. There was no sadness that consumed him. There was only gratitude, and love, and the deep understanding that Soas had already given him everything. In the following weeks, So's health began to decline. His appetite waned, and he spent more and more time resting, his energy sapped by the weight of his age. But he never left Ong's side. Even in his weakening state, he remained the boy's protector, just as he had always been. And Ong, though his heart ached at the sight of his beloved dog growing frail, did not abandon him. He stayed by Soa's side, just as Soa stayed by his side all those years ago. One evening, as Ong sat with Soas, gently brushing the dog's fur, he whispered softly, "You've done enough, So. You've given me everything." Soa lifted his head slowly, his eyes meeting Ong's with a quiet understanding. There was no sadness in those eyes, only the deep, unwavering loyalty that had defined their bond from the very beginning. It was as if Soa saying, "I've given you everything because I've always known you would carry my spirit with you. I'm not leaving, I'm just resting. You'll be okay." Ong smiled through his tears, his hand gently stroking Soa's head. "I will always remember you," he whispered. "You saved me, you saved us all." In the days that followed, the villagers began to notice the change in Soas. His once lively steps had slowed to a gentle shuffle, and his energy had begun to fade. But even as his body weakened, his spirit remained strong. He would still rise to greet Ong in the mornings, still follow him wherever he went, still stand guard by his side when the village needed him. Soa's love never faltered. And then, one morning as the sun rose over the village, and the world seemed to hold its breath, Soa lay down on the porch, where he and Ong had spent so many quiet moments together. His breathing grew slow, steady, and then, with one last gentle exhale, Soas passed away in the arms of the boy he had saved. The village was quiet for a long moment. The news of Soa's passing spread quickly, and the villagers gathered, each of them coming to pay their respects to the dog who had given them everything. There were no tears of sadness, there were tears of gratitude, of love, of remembrance. Soas had given them so much more than they had ever expected. He had given them hope when there had been none, he had saved lives when there seemed to be no way, and he had loved them all without ever asking for anything in return. Ong, his heart heavy with the loss, stood by Soa's side, his hand resting on the dog's fur. "Thank you, Soas," he whispered. "Thank you for everything." And as the villagers gathered around, they all knew that Soa's legacy would live on. His story would be passed down through generations, not just as a tale of a stray dog who had saved a boy, but as a reminder that in the face of the worst, there was always a way to find hope. That even in the darkest of times, there was always someone, or something willing to stand by you, to save you, and to help you find your way back to the light. In the years that followed, the village continued to thrive. The houses once reduced to rubble were now filled with laughter and life. The trees grew tall and strong, and though So was no longer with them, his presence was still felt in every corner of the village. The red collar with the tag that read Hope was placed in the shrine that had been built in his honor, alongside a small statue of Soas and Ong, standing side by side. The villagers never forgot the dog who had saved them, who had saved Ong, and every time they looked at that statue, they remembered that no matter how dark the world may seem, hope could always be found, even in the most unexpected places. Soas had not just been a dog, he had been a hero, and in his memory, the village lived on, stronger than ever, knowing that in the end, love and hope would always find a way to endure.